You've probably felt it before, a quiet feeling that something is wrong, even when you haven't actually done anything wrong. Maybe it happened after a thought you couldn't control, a doubt you didn't ask for, a question you were almost afraid to finish. And suddenly the feeling appears: guilt. Not because you hurt someone, not because you lied, but because you thought something you weren't supposed to think. Now here's the strange part. That feeling isn't an accident. In fact, the moment you start questioning, everything changes. Because the guilt you feel may not be a flaw in you. It may be a feature of the system itself. And once you see how it works, you start to understand something unsettling. Religion doesn't just teach belief, it teaches guilt. And the deeper reason why reveals one of the most powerful psychological mechanisms ever created: the invisible accusation. Most people believe guilt has a clear cause. You steal something that isn't yours. You lie to someone who trusted you. You hurt another person, and your conscience reacts. That kind of guilt makes sense. It serves a purpose. It signals that a boundary has been crossed and something needs to be repaired. But religious guilt often works very differently. You can feel guilty for thoughts, for curiosity, for questions that appear quietly in your mind when no one else is around. Sometimes the feeling arrives even when nothing has happened at all. No argument, no harm, no action. Just the strange sensation that something inside you is wrong. Think about that for a moment. A thought appears in your mind, uninvited, and suddenly, it feels like a moral failure. You didn't plan it. You didn't act on it. In many cases, you didn't even agree with it. Yet the feeling of guilt still appears as if an invisible accusation has been made. The strange thing is that nothing actually happened. No victim exists. No damage was done. No one was hurt. The event took place entirely inside your own mind. Yet the emotion is real. Your chest tightens slightly. A small voice inside says something like, "You shouldn't think that. You shouldn't question that. Good people don't allow those thoughts to exist." And slowly, something unusual begins to happen. You start monitoring your own mind. You begin watching your thoughts the way a guard watches a prisoner. Every idea becomes suspicious. Every doubt becomes dangerous. This is where religious guilt begins to change shape. Instead of reacting to harm, it reacts to thinking itself. The mind becomes a courtroom, and the trial never ends. Thoughts appear, and almost immediately they are judged. But this raises a strange and uncomfortable question. Why would a belief system make people feel guilty for something as natural as thinking? And if thoughts alone can trigger guilt, then where does that accusation actually come from? Because this is only the surface of the mechanism. And the deeper you look, the stranger it becomes. The thought crime. In many religions, sin does not begin with actions. It begins much earlier, in a place no one else can see. It begins in the mind. A feeling of attraction can already be considered sinful before anything happens. Anger can be judged before a single word is spoken. Doubt can become dangerous before a question is even finished. Something subtle happens here. The line between action and thought begins to disappear. Your mind slowly becomes the crime scene. Instead of being responsible only for what you do, you are now responsible for what appears inside your own head. Not just your behavior, but your imagination. Not just your choices, but your impulses. Think about the weight of that for a moment. Human thoughts are not carefully chosen one by one. They arrive automatically. A memory appears. A strange idea flashes across your mind. A question forms before you even decide to ask it. The brain is constantly generating possibilities. Images, fears, desires, doubts. Most of them pass through the mind like clouds drifting across the sky. They appear for a moment and then disappear again. But when thoughts themselves become moral territory, something unusual begins to happen. Those passing clouds are no longer harmless. Every unexpected thought becomes suspicious. Every doubt begins to feel dangerous. Even curiosity can start to feel like a small act of rebellion. And because thoughts never stop arriving, the possibility of guilt never disappears. You may behave perfectly. You may follow every rule. You may try to live exactly the way you were taught. Yet the mind keeps producing thoughts on its own. And if those thoughts can be labeled sinful, then guilt becomes something permanent. Not an occasional signal that you have harmed someone, but a constant background feeling that something inside you needs correction. This is where the mechanism begins to reveal its power. Because constant guilt does something predictable to human psychology. It creates a sense that you are always slightly flawed, always slightly in need of forgiveness, always in need of guidance. And once that feeling takes hold, something even more powerful appears: dependence. Because the moment you start questioning, everything changes. The psychological trap. Now imagine a system where you are always slightly wrong. Not a monster, not beyond redemption, just flawed enough to require constant correction. You are told that something inside you is broken. Not completely broken, but deeply imperfect. Your desires can mislead you, your thoughts can betray you, your instincts can pull you away from what is right. So even when you try your best, there is always a quiet suggestion that you are falling short. This is the perfect psychological trap. Because if the problem lives inside you, then the solution must come from somewhere outside you. You cannot fully trust your own mind. You cannot fully rely on your own judgment. Guidance must come from the system that identified the problem in the first place. And slowly religion becomes the cure for the guilt it creates. When the feeling grows too heavy, there is always a path back. Confess what you thought. Repent for the doubts that appeared. Pray for forgiveness. Return to the rules that promise safety. For a moment, relief appears. The tension eases. The guilt fades. You feel forgiven, restored, accepted again. But the relief never lasts forever. Sooner or later, another thought appears. Another doubt enters your mind. Another human impulse quietly reminds you that you are still imperfect. And the cycle begins again. This pattern works in a way that resembles quicksand. The harder you struggle to eliminate every forbidden thought, the more aware you become of them. The more you try to escape the feeling, the more it seems to surround you. Because the system does not remove guilt permanently, it resets it. And the moment you start questioning, everything changes. Because once you begin to see the cycle, you notice something unsettling. The guilt and the cure are coming from the same place. But this psychological pattern is not unique to religion. In fact, the deeper roots of this mechanism reach far beyond belief systems alone. The social reinforcement. Now, imagine an entire community built around the same feeling. Not just one person carrying quiet guilt, but thousands of people sharing the same rules, the same warnings, and the same invisible boundaries. Everyone around you believes the same moral map of the world, the same ideas about what thoughts are dangerous, the same expectations about what a good person should feel. And slowly, something changes. Guilt stops being just a private emotion. It becomes social. If you question too much, you do not simply risk being wrong. You risk disappointing people who matter to you. Your parents who raised you with these beliefs. Your friends who built their lives around them. The community that welcomed you, supported you, and gave you a sense of belonging. Now the pressure becomes much stronger. Because human beings are not designed to live alone. Our brains evolved in tribes, small groups where survival depended on acceptance. To be rejected by the group once meant losing protection, losing resources, sometimes even losing life itself. That ancient instinct still lives inside us. When people feel the possibility of rejection, the brain reacts with surprising intensity. The same regions that process physical pain begin to activate. Social exclusion literally hurts. So the mind learns something very quickly. It learns that harmony with the group feels safe. Agreement feels safe. Belonging feels safe. Questioning, on the other hand, begins to feel dangerous. Not necessarily because the question is wrong, but because the cost of asking it might be too high. So a quiet compromise forms inside the mind. It becomes easier to carry a small amount of guilt than to risk the loneliness of standing apart. Better to doubt silently than to question openly. Better to feel slightly flawed than to lose the comfort of belonging. But this is where the system gains even more strength. Because when guilt is shared by an entire community, it no longer feels imposed, it feels normal. And that is what makes the mechanism so powerful. Yet, This pattern runs deeper than psychology alone. To understand why it became so widespread, you have to look at how belief and power have shaped human history. The historical design. For most of human history, religion did not exist only as a private belief about the universe. It functioned as the organizing structure of entire societies. It defined laws, shaped moral expectations, and gave authority to those who ruled. Kings did not simply claim power. They ruled with divine approval. Their authority was described as part of a cosmic order. To challenge the ruler was not only political rebellion, it was spiritual disobedience. Priests served a different role. They interpreted divine law, explained sacred texts, and defined what counted as sin. Their words carried weight because they were believed to speak on behalf of something higher than human judgment. Communities completed the structure. Neighbors watched each other. Families enforced the same rules inside their homes. Entire villages shared the same moral expectations. Within this structure, guilt became something extremely useful. It acted like an invisible police force. If people believe that an all-seeing authority observes every action and even every thought, control becomes remarkably efficient. No guard has to stand outside your door. No prison wall needs to surround the town. The believer carries the authority inside their own mind. A person may be alone in a room, yet still feel watched. A thought appears, and immediately an inner voice asks whether that thought is sinful. The surveillance becomes internal. This is one of the most powerful forms of control ever created. Instead of forcing obedience through visible punishment, the system teaches people to regulate themselves. The individual becomes responsible for monitoring their own behavior, their own desires, even their own imagination. In a sense, every believer becomes their own prison guard, and as long as that guard remains strong, the system continues to function without resistance. But something interesting happens when doubt begins to appear. A question forms quietly in the mind. A person wonders whether the authority watching them is truly there. And the moment you start questioning, everything changes, because the inner guard begins to weaken. Once the mind allows the possibility that the watcher may not exist, the mechanism of control slowly begins to lose its power. The paradox of strong belief. Here is the paradox most people rarely stop to notice. The beliefs people defend with the most passion are often the very beliefs they feel most afraid to question. Think about how certain conversations unfold. A simple question appears, not an attack, not a mockery, just a quiet curiosity about why something must be believed. And suddenly the emotional temperature rises. Voices sharpen. Defenses appear almost instantly. The reaction is often much stronger than the question itself. This is where the paradox begins to reveal itself. If a belief were truly unshakable, questions would not feel threatening. Curiosity would not feel dangerous. A strong idea can withstand examination because its foundation does not depend on silence. But when doubt triggers fear or anger, something else may be happening beneath the surface. Sometimes the reaction is not about protecting truth. It is about protecting certainty. Certainty provides stability. It creates a clear map of the world, a set of answers that feel final. When someone questions those answers, the mind senses a possible crack in the structure that holds everything together. That possibility alone can feel unsettling. So, instead of examining the question, the mind often moves to defend the belief. The faster the defense appears, the less time the doubt has to grow. But here is the uncomfortable realization. A belief that cannot survive questions was never truly strong. Strength does not require silence. Strength invites examination because it has nothing to fear from clarity. This is where guilt begins to play an important role. Guilt acts like a protective shield around fragile ideas. If asking questions creates the feeling that you are doing something wrong, the mind learns to avoid those questions entirely. The belief remains untouched, not because it is unbreakable, but because curiosity has been discouraged. Over time, the protection becomes automatic. People feel the impulse to defend certain beliefs long before they fully understand why. And this leads to a deeper philosophical question. If a belief must be protected from questions in order to survive, what exactly is being protected? The fear of freedom. Questioning belief does something quietly dangerous. Not dangerous in the sense of violence or chaos, but dangerous to the structure that once provided certainty. The moment a person begins to question deeply held beliefs, something subtle begins to shift. Authority starts to loosen its grip. For a long time, the answers may have come from somewhere outside you. Sacred texts, religious leaders, traditions passed down through generations. They provided a map of what is right and wrong, what is true and false, what thoughts are acceptable and which ones should be avoided. But questioning interrupts that system. Suddenly, the responsibility moves inward. You are no longer simply receiving answers. You are evaluating them. You are no longer following a script that someone else wrote. You are deciding which parts make sense and which parts no longer fit. That change can feel strangely unsettling, because certainty has a powerful emotional comfort. Even when the certainty is built on guilt, it still provides clear rules and predictable consequences. The world feels ordered. Every question already has an answer waiting. But uncertainty works differently. When certainty fades, the mind enters unfamiliar territory. Instead of ready-made answers, there are possibilities. Instead of fixed rules, there are choices. You begin to realize that understanding the world may require more effort than simply accepting a system that explains everything. That realization can feel heavy at first. Freedom is often described as something purely positive, but psychological freedom also carries responsibility. Without a final authority deciding what is true, the burden of thinking shifts onto the individual. You must examine ideas, you must weigh evidence, you must decide what values make sense to you, and that responsibility can feel intimidating. Yet this is also where something important begins to happen. Once the fear of questioning starts to fade, the mind becomes more curious. Instead of avoiding difficult questions, it begins to explore them. And the moment you start questioning, everything changes. But this realization leads somewhere unexpected. Because beyond the fear of freedom lies another discovery about why belief systems have held such powerful influence over human minds: the human need for meaning. Here is the truth that often gets lost in arguments about belief. Religion did not become powerful because people were foolish or easily manipulated. It became powerful because it spoke directly to something deeply human. Human beings search for meaning. We look for patterns in chaos. We want the world to make sense. We want our lives to feel connected to something larger than random events and passing moments. From the earliest civilizations, people have asked the same questions. Why are we here? What happens after death? Why does suffering exist? What separates good from evil? These questions do not disappear simply because someone doubts religion. They remain part of the human condition. Religion offered answers that felt complete. It provided stories that explained the origins of the world. It provided rules that defined right and wrong. It created a sense that life was part of a larger purpose rather than an accident of nature. For many people, those answers brought genuine comfort. Religion created communities where people shared the same rituals and values. It offered hope during loss and suffering. It promised justice in a world that often feels unfair. In that sense, belief did not spread only because of power or control. It spread because it addressed emotional and existential needs that every human experiences. But there is a delicate balance inside that system. When belief offers meaning without demanding fear, people often embrace it willingly. But when belonging requires constant guilt, something inside the human mind begins to resist. Not loudly at first. The resistance appears as a quiet uneasiness. A small question that returns again and again. A feeling that certain rules no longer make sense in the way they once did. People may try to ignore that feeling. They may push the question aside and return to the familiar structure that once provided comfort. Yet, the question often returns. Slowly, quietly, the mind continues to explore possibilities that once felt forbidden. And the moment you start questioning, everything changes. Because questioning does not necessarily destroy meaning. Sometimes, it becomes the beginning of discovering meaning for yourself. If you have ever felt guilty simply for asking questions, you are not broken. In fact, questioning is one of the most natural instincts the human mind possesses. Curiosity is the force that pushed humanity forward long before we understood the world around us. Curiosity built science. It built philosophy. It challenged old assumptions and opened paths that once seemed impossible. Nearly every discovery that reshaped human understanding began with someone quietly asking a question others were afraid to ask. Yet some systems teach people to fear that instinct. Because questions are powerful. They loosen ideas that once seemed immovable and reveal cracks in beliefs that once felt untouchable. And the moment you start questioning, everything changes. Not because belief instantly disappears, but because fear slowly begins to fade. When fear fades, thinking becomes possible again. So maybe the deeper question is not whether religion exists, but why guilt has been used for so long to protect belief. If you have ever questioned something you were taught to believe, write, "I started questioning" in the comments. Stay curious, and never stop asking questions.